I need to YouTube it. There we go. All right, everybody, welcome back to the House Government Operations and Military Affairs Committee. We are picking up our testimony this afternoon with the state auditor on S9. So thank you, Mr. Auditor, for being back.
Thank you for inviting me back. For the record, Doug Hofford, State Auditor. You heard a number of people earlier, and I know you had materials from some others. So I have also sent you some materials, which I hope you've had a chance to look over. I'm going to do this sort of like a, in particular order. I'm going to respond to some of the things you heard today. For example, Matt, who I spoke to out in the hall afterwards, said that he had heard from some of your colleagues and others that the reason for our interest in OneCare was because of an aggrieved employee. That is absolutely false. There is no truth to that whatsoever. Zero. I want that made very clear. I would never do that. On the other hand, I came to this body years ago, 8, 9 years ago, and said, I want to encourage state employees to feel comfortable coming to my office as whistleblowers, but I want to protect their identity, which I can do. But in those 10 years, we've only done one audit related to a whistleblower. It's not common. And in this case, it simply did not happen. In fact, there's a story about why we went to OCV. We had done some work there previously, looking at some, in fact, Mike Fisher was responsible for us learning about this. Their contract at that time, DEVA, included a bunch of deliverables that were not related to their core function, which was managing the all-payer program. And we said, how are you doing with those investments? Because they did it with partners and nonprofits and others around the state. And they said, we really don't have good data. We thought, that's interesting. So about 1.5 years later, they went to the Green Mountain Care Board with their budget proposal, which showed a very significant increase in payroll. And we thought, well, maybe we'd like to learn more about how they're allocating their resources, because we know that they couldn't tell us their success or not on these items here. And I'd like to know how much money they're devoting to those efforts. That's all it was about, period. And the reason we had to do that is because the Green Mountain Care Board didn't care, which is disappointing, nor did DEVA, which was the contractor. So we did it. That's the whole story. And that led to this. So the second one was Matt, I think both in the Senate and here, expressed concern about the level of detail of information that we might request from contractors. Well, I can tell you that we've done 3 or 4 jobs about contracting in Vermont, and we have never sought details of that nature, ever. As a rule, what we're looking for is information about the extent to which the contracting entity, BGS, AOT, now we're doing one on ADS, which isn't contracting, construction, but it's the same kind of thing, project management. That's what we're interested in. Do they deliver on time and on price? So we would have no reason to go into the records that he suggested, are already there and useful, and they are, but we wouldn't need them as a rule. So that's one. This notion that the state auditor's office should be required to show probable cause to do an audit, my head started spinning. I mean, we're not talking about a criminal indictment. We're talking about an audit, a performance audit. And furthermore, in fairness to Matt and many, many others who don't know what we do, we don't just say one day, I don't just say, hey, let's audit Bob's program. No, there's a process. And it starts with what's called a risk assessment. And a team gets together and looks into his program and finds out, has there been an audit recently? Have the feds looked at it that has federal funding? Is there any reason to believe there are problems? All this stuff, and they take weeks just on the risk assessment, which they then report to me and my deputy. And we have a conversation about how much work is this? What can we learn? Can we add value? Is it worth our time? And that's a big deal. To make a decision to do a performance audit is a very big deal. I'm allocating resources from my office that are scarce. And I know full well that it's going to be a bother for Bob and his organization. On the other hand, if I think it's worthwhile and will be useful to you guys, plus project managers, and informative to citizens, we do it. We don't do that many because we don't have many resources. So the idea that we would need probable cause, I'm not even sure what that would mean for us, but it's a crazy idea. Also, it was suggested maybe by Matt, somebody else, that it would be problematic if we were doing an audit at the same time as Bob's organization was doing it. Well, first of all, you may not know this, but to my knowledge, there are only 2 entities in the whole state that have what is referred to as internal audit capabilities. And that's AOT, AHS. That's it. That doesn't mean that the other departments and agencies don't have people who care about the execution of contracts that are entered into by those business units, but they don't do audits. They simply don't do them. And you might not be surprised to know that when we have what's called the entrance meeting, after we've decided to do this job on Bob's program, we invite him and all his people in and we talk about it. We tell them what we have in mind, the objectives, the time frame, so forth. And the questions at the end of that include every single time, are there any legal or audit related functions going on right now that we don't know about? Because if he's in litigation related to our work, we're not going to do the job until it's done. So you don't want audit work interfering with litigation. And the same is true for audit. In my 10 years, I have never heard a department or agency say, oh yeah, we have an audit going. Not once. So the idea that we would be, that our work would be redundant with theirs is simply not borne out by my experience anyway. I think one of the representatives from the Hospital Association referred to the court case and said that it reaffirmed, that the court's decision reaffirmed existing law. That is absolutely false. Prior to that decision, every single contractor, we've talked about this before, every single contract for services in the state includes that provision in attachment C of Bulletin 3.5 that says, it's cleverly called the audit provision, if you're a contractor now, not a program guy, you will retain the records necessary for an audit of your performance under the contract, period. That's been there for decades. That was the real world prior to the court's decision. Interestingly, what we're facing now is the real change. If you don't approve S9, the body, both bodies don't approve S9, then the world really does change. Because as was pointed out, I think you asked the question, what happens if being required to go to the agency, they say, we don't have what you need, or we'd rather not give you what you're requesting? That puts the state auditor, an independent constitutional office, in the position of saying, I can only work if the governor approves that work. I'm pretty sure that's not what the founders had in mind. They created an independent office. I would love to work with the executive branch and you guys, of course, and anybody who wants to work for us. But I have to be independent to do this work. And if I can only do the work based on the approval of a secretary or commissioner, you've got a problem. That's a problem. And I don't think you want that problem. That means that's a diminution in the responsibilities and authority of this office. And there's going to be a cost. You're going to miss something. You're going to lose something important. To me, anyway. The idea that in doing our work, this is back to the question of agencies and departments do their own audits and they review the work of contractors like we do, which isn't true, that we might have different standards for performance. We don't make up standards for performance, period. We use the standards that are either in the contract or best practices from around the country or from their own regulations or statutory authority. It's funny that people come through here and talk about our work, but they've never called me to learn about our work. So, why would we make up standards? Do you think that I would see that as a way to build the integrity of the office? No. So we don't make up performance standards. And this, I think, again, the hospital representative referred to how this, if you adopt S9, it will lead to two different types of oversight mechanisms. No, first of all, the agencies don't do what we do. They don't do GAGA's performance audits, period. Second, if they're doing something, God forbid, I would like them to do that, then we won't, period. If they ever answer the question in the entrance meeting in response to, are you doing an audit right now? And they say, yes, we'd say, great, let us know when you're done. So there's just a lot of misinformation and misleading stuff here, which is too bad. I sent something, I don't know if you guys have time to read anything at this point, but this notion of access to HIPAA records, personal health information, really important. I noodled around in Health and Human Services last night and found the Code of Federal Regulations, which refers to those entities which are allowed to see PHI. And notwithstanding what you heard, which is not entirely accurate, audits are mentioned specifically in this language. In the description of what's referred to as the health oversight, what is it here? The Health Oversight Agency is about a 6-line definition, and it includes audits. Who does audits? Auditors. So, and the purpose of those audits, or the purpose of accessing that information and using them for audits, for appropriate oversight of the healthcare system, government benefit programs for which health information is relevant to beneficiary eligibility. We've done those audits. Third, entities subject to government regulatory programs for which health information is necessary for determining compliance with program standards. That's what we do. That's how and why we have accessed this information before. So don't believe anybody who says we weren't intended to be included. We are. Second, the idea that an auditor, not me, obviously, the future auditor, or anyone in the auditor's office would knowingly disclose PHI is inconceivable to me. It can be a felony if you do it knowingly, and you can be charged $50,000 to $200,000 and put in jail. And if you're an elected official, gosh, I'm pretty sure you wouldn't get reelected. If you're an auditor in my office, you'd be fired. So what could possibly motivate someone to do that? Having said that, people do strange things. I get it, but this seems a stretch to me. With regard to the concerns, again, raised by Matt and previously by Doug Farnham and others about the chilling effect, I will remind you only and not belabor it. There are 12 states that currently have explicit language authorizing the state auditor to obtain and make use of contractor records, period, without interference by the contracting entity. I don't need, if I'm in one of those 12 states, I don't have to get permission. Having said that, I want to remind you, as I said before, as a rule, we don't start with the contracting entity. Or rather, we don't start with the contractor. We start with the agency or department. And a good example, Ms. Tesler is not here, I guess. I don't really know. Oh, there she is. She sent you some written testimony, which is, I think, appropriate for me to then comment on how we used some of this PHI in a job related to the designated agencies who she represents. There was no problem in obtaining the information we needed, and I'll tell you why we used it and what came of it. Because both parties assumed at that time, this is 9 years ago, that Bulletin 3.5 and item 13 in attachment C meant what it said. If you sign this contract, you will provide the records related to your performance to an agent of the state for purposes of audit. And they did. They didn't even question that. Now, back to the issue, the broader issue of what do you get for us? Because one of the other things Ms. Tesler said is, in effect, I'm paraphrasing, this is unnecessary. It's redundant. It's already covered. She went on to list a bunch of things that they're required to do. I don't doubt that at all. They are a regulated entity.
I apologize. We're having trouble with our door in here. It's because
I saw that, yeah.
distraction.
Could it be one of these guys?
Yeah, it's the ghost of one of the governors on the wall. It has to be.
So anyway, we were interested in some questions related to Dale and DMH and their relationship with the DAs. And for context, by the way, at that time, and I know it's gone up since, we're talking about $300 million taxpayer funds that goes through the DAs. And they're effectively instrumentalities of the state. So it's kind of not a fair example, but they're private, they're monopolies, they're funded by the state, federal government, and so forth. But notwithstanding all the work that they do to report to all the people they're answerable to, we did something that nobody had done nor would do because they don't take the perspective we do. We were interested in the extent to which Dale and DMH were assured that when they got an invoice from one of the DAs and they said, we provided these services in this quantity to these people, could they document that? And it worked both ways. There was an obligation on the part of the DAs and the state. Well, in some cases, they couldn't. That doesn't mean there was anything wrong, except that the record keeping and reporting wasn't optimal. No corruption, none of that stuff. It's just that there was a problem. But in order to do it, we had to look at both sides of the equation. both Dale and DMH and the DAs and their records and PHI. And by the way, as an aside on PHI, personal healthcare information, when our teams go into an entity and are presented with either PHI or other types of confidential data, they don't just say, great, give us everything. They say, here's what we think we're going to need. What does that mean to you? And they say, well, we can give you this. It's a lot of work. And then we say, well, are there personal identifiers? And they say yes, or sometimes they say no. And sometimes in the case of the DAs, sorry to point at you, in the case of the DAs, we were looking at multiple DAs and 2 different state agencies. So the personal identifier that identified Bob or his kid or whatever, somebody who got services from them, wasn't the same across agencies or DAs. So if we had an identifier that's good throughout the entire system, then we don't need names. And we use numbers. That's easier for us. Because if you're working with names, that means, you're one of the guys at one of the agencies that inputs the data, or more likely at the DA. People make mistakes when they hand input stuff on a keyboard. They spell a name wrong. It's close. It's off by a letter or 2. So we have to spend time, our staff, with certain types of software to make sure we're getting all the Jack Browns, John, Jack Jr., Brown with an E, whatever, all that stuff. So, but we never go in and just insist on give us everything you have. We want to make it easy for them. We certainly want to make it easy for us. So we de-identify every chance we get. Sometimes we can't. We couldn't in that case because of the multiple players. So anyway, the idea that this information, but again, is made available to the state auditor's office, is a bridge too far and is going to, who knows what could happen, is bizarre when you think that there are literally hundreds, if not thousands of people today in the state of Vermont that have access to that information. And not just from healthcare providers, in state government. So, we've used PHI, I think on 3 or 4 occasions in 10 years. And you've never heard about it because we protected it. So to think, as they would have you believe, that we're really uncomfortable, it's too much, we can't trust the system, it's not Doug, could be anybody, I ask you to really think seriously about that. The system is rife with potential for breach every single day. The fact that it doesn't happen more often is a testament to the strength of the statute and the fact that most people involved take this very seriously, as they should. They're not just kidding around. This is a big deal, and they can see themselves in this situation, I think, I expect, I hope. So I hope we can put, the confidential data thing to rest. The statute takes care of, the S9 takes care of it. It kind of reinforces what's already in federal and state law. That shouldn't be an issue at all. This question of our work being redundant and that other entities are doing it is demonstrably false because they're not doing it. Furthermore, to suggest that there's no need for what we do ignores the fact that in all of these jobs, we've had findings and recommendations that have improved the system because of our work. It was not done by the contracting and the business unit. So this has all been a little frustrating, as you can imagine. But I'd be happy to take questions. Other stuff might come up, but in the end, to me, the real issue is about whether you want this office, the state auditor's office, to be subject to the approval of the governor and his or her appointees going forward, to do work on $1 billion worth of money. And to say, for example, as some have and will, and it may be literally true, that's not state government. He's a contractor. But for who's he doing the work for? Whose money is it? When the statute says, 163, that the state auditor may, at his discretion, do an audit of any state entity. There's a litany of things, including sheriffs and so forth. That's true. It says just that. It's narrowly written. On the other hand, in the middle of almost the middle of the 21st century, how do you define the work of state government? Clearly, with $1 billion at $8 billion, it includes all the work of the contractors. Now, the court didn't like that. They said to you guys, in effect, if you want that to be the case, just say so. I'll give them that. They were a little positive, which was better than nothing. But
yeah, so I appreciate your willingness to take some questions. So I'll get started. I imagine other folks on the committee have questions. I actually think that the point you make about the personal healthcare information. If I take the questions that some of the folks on the committee have asked of various witnesses, and a couple of times we've taken testimony on S9, I don't think that's the primary concern that we have on the committee right now because of the protections that you mentioned. I actually wanted to drill down on some questions with you into what came up in the OneCare case was this idea of what does it mean to be an agent of the state? Now, you made it very clear in your testimony when you first came in on this bill that it's sort of on its face silly to suggest that the state auditor isn't an agent of the state. But I think that what some of our other folks have gotten at in testimony is this idea that they have a contract with the executive branch agency. Different entities, we've heard everybody from the folks building our roads, certain people representing the hospitals to do healthcare, right? So should there be a process that says the auditor is auditing the contract, goes to the agency, audits the agency, and if they can't get the documents that they need in order to do that thoroughly, that your office, some future auditor, shouldn't have to go through that process before they go directly to the contractor. And so one of the key concerns I wanted to bring up for you was, is there a path to satisfy that concern by saying that there has to be an actual audit? You talked about the process of doing the risk assessment. I think that's great. Does the next auditor necessarily have to do a thorough multi-week risk assessment? I don't know that we know the answer to that question here. So those are some of the thoughts that I had hearing the testimony.
That's great, thank you. And I'm sorry I didn't mention that. This office and virtually every state auditor's office in America works with what we refer to as the Professional Standards Manual. And it is based on some federal and nationally recognized guidelines for this work of government bodies. Everybody uses the same professional standards. And if you find somebody who doesn't, then they're rogue and it's inappropriate. So it's not me. I didn't come into office with a PSM. It was there. It is updated periodically, infrequently, every 3 or 4 years if we find reason. But if you go, and in fact, I know this because one of my top auditors participates in what's called peer review. All state auditors around the country have their work reviewed by a team of auditors from different states. They come in and pick reports that you've done over the last few years, and they evaluate your work based on those standards, those very standards. So if you don't follow those standards, you're not going to get a passing grade from the peer review. And if my shop doesn't get a passing grade from the peer review, that's news. And not only do I think that's stupid and unnecessary because there's no reason not to meet the standards, but if it happened, that's embarrassing and I should be kicked out. That's the baseline. That's what you have to do. When I took the oath, it meant we're going to damn well, forgive me, live by those rules, not just statutes and regulations, but that guidance, PSM. It comes from the Yellow Book, from the federal government, from OMB and GAO and so forth. So that, I hope that answers your question about where that comes from. It comes from something that has nothing to do with me. Every auditor before me and every auditor after me uses the same guidelines.
Is your office's requirement to use those guidelines, I think I know the answer to this question, spell that specifically in statute?
That's a good question.
Future auditor decide, you know what, I'm not following PSM.
Actually, we are required, I don't know what you know about our funding, probably nothing. 90% of our money comes from an internal service fund called the SARF, the Single Audit Revolving Fund. And the methodology used to determine how agencies and departments pay into the SARF is approved by Finance and Management and the federal government, the Office of Management Budget. So that includes a couple of layers of things. If you don't get federal money, it's basically how much is your budget as a percentage of state government. That's one consideration for how much you pay into the fund. The other is federal money. How much federal money do you get? Because that's a burden for audit purposes, and on and on. So that pot, the SARF, pays for the independent audit firm that does the single audit, which is the federal compliance audit, which is boring but important. The audit of the state's financial statements, and pays our staff to do performance auditing. The only way I can pay our staff is if they do SARF eligible work, which is GAGAS based, generally accepted government auditing standards, which is basically the PSM. Yes, is to answer your question. This is serious stuff. I mean, these people in my office, they're not kidding around. They're not exactly party people, but they take their work very seriously. They're auditors and they know who they work for. They work for you and you take it very seriously.
I think the struggle that we have is, in considering this bill, is trying to reconcile the description that you have of the way the auditor's office should work and does work today with the concerns that serious people who, it may be not well founded, but serious people are bringing to us the concern that this could allow a future auditor to go directly to contractors and ask them for things like payroll information. And if they don't want to provide it, then they're going to get stuck in costly litigation to try to prove that their documents aren't relevant to the performance of their contract with the state. And that's something I'm stuck on it. I just want to give you an opportunity to just respond to that very fundamental concern that people that I think you and I have enormous respect for have been bringing up. And I think you've responded to it in different ways, but it still remains kind of for the committee a sticking point on this bill.
Well, two things. One, some of the people you've heard from are self-interested. There are entities that receive enormous amounts of state money, taxpayer funds, that don't want to be independently audited. What a shock. They're happy having a relationship with a state agency or department. And for many purposes, that's fine. But that is not going to serve you and your colleagues in this building the way an independent audit function will. That's the difference. As for One Fair Vermont asking for payroll information, I will say this again. We did it for a reason. Trying to understand how they allocated their own personnel resources to achieve the goals that they couldn't tell us how they were succeeding or not in the deliverables identified in the contract from that time. That's a perfectly reasonable question. Furthermore, I told you, we started with the board. They expressed no interest in this question whatsoever. Furthermore, this is my bad. I asked the commissioner of DEVA at that time, he would ask them for the data for me, but I did it on the phone. I have no written record of that. My bad. And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. I don't care about that. That's the point. That's all it takes to stop us. I didn't start bothering OCV just for the heck of it. Nor would anybody else in my position. What do you have to gain? The job is about answering questions that we think are important to you guys and to the people in the state. So I hope, you can either take my word for it or not, but I'm here to tell you, I didn't start with this on a lark, honestly.
I think the challenge for all of us is that we, being citizen legislators, have to take people's word for a lot in here. And so it gives us hesitation when they're saying diametrically opposed things that we can't figure out how to, so we may just end up having to make a decision on that about who to trust. Yeah, well, but oftentimes we're able to compromise and come up with things that satisfy the concerns. And on this particular bill, it's been a challenge to find any more middle ground than the Senate reached, and yet there are still concerns from folks that were at least trying to err here.
Only, in fairness, you've heard from some people, as I say, that are self-interested and represent primarily the healthcare industry. I don't know why you don't have more people in the room. You heard from the administration, and Doug Farnham, who I like and respect, sat in this chair and said, I don't think the auditor should get between the contracting entity and the contractor. Is that a rule? Did you make that up? How do you expect to be assured independently that that relationship is giving you what you're paying for if you don't have an independent party, as he put it, get between the business entity and the contractor? But the way it was presented was, ooh, that's a bad idea. I never heard that before, ever. And in 10 years in this office, nobody ever questioned our request for contract-related information until OneCare. No one until then. And as I said, every single contract includes the audit provisions. How come you didn't have a bunch of people coming in here saying, we can't live with this? This is a moment in time where there's an opportunity for people who don't like some of what we are, I think, authorized to do They don't like it. They'd rather not have it. That's the bottom line, I think.
So we still have time to take testimony from other folks if there are voices that you feel like we need to hear. But I just want to take a little bit of umbrage here as the chair of this committee that we haven't had the room open. I've allowed anybody who's asked to testify on this to testify, and I just want that on the record. So
That's my point. But who came in? It's not like you were flooded with people, right?
well,
And furthermore, prior to the court decision,
I'm not going to have an argument here with
I'm not arguing with you.
about who we should have in the chair. And I just want to, for the committee, let folks know, I want there to be, this committee's been open to hearing testimony from people with all sides on any issue. But it's not, we're not closing off the dialogue to anybody on this particular bill.
If that's what you heard me say, that's not what I meant.
So I think you've given us a lot to think about. We're not acting on this bill today. I think that what I'd like to do is the one other witness that we had scheduled to testify, go ahead and give her testimony, and then we'll take a quick break. But thank you very much, Auditor Huffer.
Will you come back after the break?
We are supposed to hear the introduction of another bill and then go to the floor. So we're going to wrap up our testimony on S9 today, and then we'll decide as a committee kind of what our next steps are going to be. Yes, Representative Murphy.
I'm sorry.
Sharing an opinion right now, but a perspective of mine, and it goes, I know this is not about One Care, but it goes back to it. I've been to several meetings with One Care, about One Care, and I still don't get it. And I think it's hard to find information about it, and I appreciate what's being tried to be done here by the auditor. And I think an example of them not doing a good job was I just went to their website, pressed on a link that said, our work, and at the top of the page, it says no results found. Now, if you dig down deeper, there's some headlines, but I think there's a problem there when that's what comes up when you're looking for information about One Care, no results found. So I hope, again, this is not about One Care, but I think we need to find more information about this, and whatever we can do to help that, I'd like to see that we do it.
Thank you. Seems like the Green Mountain Care Board has turned the corner on this question. They're asking tougher questions.
So I think, Ms. Hessler, we are kind of over time, but I wanted to give you an opportunity. I know we've got a written testimony, but you wanted to offer your thoughts, and then we'll move off of S9 for today.
Sure. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm sorry that I had a board meeting and I wasn't able to be here earlier. I could be the first one to say, why aren't more people here? My colleagues kind of had to draft me here because I'm a social worker, and this is legal stuff and things that are a little beyond us. And a lot of nonprofits don't have the resources to be following legislations and bills. And I wouldn't have seen this without my colleagues pointing it out. So I think there's reasons why the room isn't fuller. If more people knew what the implications were, I think it would be. And just quickly to introduce myself, there's a few of you who know me. Vermont Care Partners represents 16 designated and specialized service agencies that provide developmental, mental health, and substance use services to over 30,000 Vermonters with about 5,000 employees, mostly in people's homes and communities, places of work. We do oppose S9, and I really don't understand the purpose of it and why it's so necessary, because we were the departments that oversee our work were audited. We were not audited by the state auditor, but the departments were. At no point in that process did we ever hear that there wasn't sufficient information, that greater access was needed. I would say that one of the challenges of having an outside auditor come in was lack of understanding about our very complex financing reporting processes, which really are much more complicated than you can imagine. The departments, we do have a provider agreement with Department of Mental Health, Department of Aging and Independent Living, Disabilities Aging Independent Living, the Department of Health. as well as some with other departments within state government. They lay out what we do and they have oversight. We have independent audits from an independent auditing firm, and we submit those to state government. So there's an independent audit that comes in. We have quality reviews, we have designation reviews, and we do 240 reporting measures to state government to inform them of what we're doing and how we're doing it. So we feel like we're very accountable. There was some value from the state auditor's review of us several years ago, and some things did get tightened up. But there was a lot of back and forth with explaining how processes work. I'll skip the part about the data. And I guess the last thing I'd like to say is we have a very hard time recruiting and retaining staff. The number one reason is that we're underfunded and their salaries and compensation is ridiculously low, much lower than state employees and other people doing similar work around the state. But the second reason people leave is documentation. And it's a ton of information that we collect. And it's difficult. It's very confidential information. And that process of collecting information, retaining information, reporting information, it's a really big drag on our system of care because we're so under-resourced. We'd want to put all the resources to provide the services. And we're getting caught in report, document. And so I wonder if this is going to impact that. But I do think that the state departments that work with us understand our work. I don't think that they're easy on us at all. It can be pretty critical. And they're accountable. And I think we're very accountable and transparent. So for us, I'm not sure I understand the value added. And I'm sorry that I can't address some of the more complex issues that you're dealing with, but that's all I can do. Did I miss anything?
I think we heard from some of your colleagues in other healthcare organizations earlier today, so with similar testimony, but I don't know if anybody else has questions for Ms. Tessler about the Care Partners experience. Well, thank you very much for being with us today. Senator White, do we have you for a few minutes, or do you back to the floor?
For a few minutes, yeah, we just voted on H230, 109, if anyone's wondering. And we have one more bill that I may have to leave to vote on.
Okay, so why don't we go ahead and switch gears. I'm sorry to do whiplash since we have limited time with the reporter of the bill, but we're going to switch gears completely here. So thank you everybody for being who's in on S9. We're going to invite Senator White to do a brief introduction. Then we'll take just a very short few minutes. And then if you've got time, we have you, Jen. Thank you. It's been quite a day scheduling everything. So Senator White, thank you for giving us the quick introduction on S39. Appreciate you doing that on short notice.
Hey, I'm here for you. Thank you so much for having me, House Government Operations. So Senator Rebecca White for the record, and I'm going to give you an introduction of S39, which is colloquially known as the Legislative Pay and Benefits Bill. This bill was a product that the Government Operations Committee on the Senate side endeavored to create because of, in part, some bills that you had on your side. You had multiple House bills that came up around legislative pay or compensation or the structure of our legislature, as well as bills we saw in the Senate. So our goal was to try to incorporate both introduced bills that you had on your side and suggestions that we had from senators. So the bill itself has multiple sections, but I want to give you an overview first of what it does, and then I'm happy to do more of a section by section, but you also have the far more qualified legislative counsel, Jen Carvey, who can do that for you even more robustly than I can. I'll start by saying that we felt that reasonable compensation was our guiding principle, and that's because in the Vermont State Constitution, we actually have a concept around public service, and I'll just quote the Vermont Constitution where it says, but if any person is called into public service to the prejudice of the person's private affairs, the person has a right to reasonable compensation. So that's in the Vermont Constitution. pretty direct and clear, I think, on what the intent is there. And we endeavored to see what reasonable compensation actually looked like and if we were meeting that standard in part with our current compensation and benefits. So the bill, as it came out of government operations, included healthcare benefits being extended to legislators. We heard from multiple members, actually from the House, that their access to healthcare was the difference between their ability to be able to serve and not serve. In particular, women had brought that forward to us. It also increases the weekly pay in session. So the amount that we make now, and I hope you did your expenses today, is around $880 a week. And we increase that to around $1,210 per week. Now that was originally in the Senate version, something that happened immediately next session. The appropriations amendment has it phasing in over time. Just a note if you're interested in that conversation.
Just to be clear, the Senate as passed bill is phased in by
2027?
So a 4-year phase.
Yes, a 2 biennium phase in. Yeah. And that was in part because we had, I would say, frankly, some media of doubling your legislative pay. And obviously when you go from 13,000 to under 29,000, doubling is a strong, it's the correct word, but it is also perhaps a media buzzword. And we wanted to phase it in so that we weren't getting that kind of, you are doubling this next session or with the next legislative session, or at least that was the Appropriations Committee's suggestion, which we adopted. It also looks at legislative compensation for leadership. So if you don't know already, our Senate Pro Tem and our Speaker of the House also have a salary, and we look at that. Both of these are connected to the average Vermont wage. That was where we tied that reasonable compensation question to it. The average Vermont wage at a prorated rate per week. So we used to actually have this. Over 20 years ago, we had it tied, and that was changed. So we would have been moving up and gotten the average Vermont wage if we had not changed it over 20 years ago. But the average Vermont wage is around $55,000 a year. Obviously, we would not be making $55,000 a year. We only work on average, 13 to 18 weeks per year. So it's the average Vermont wage per week. We also look at off-session compensation. We heard from many folks that they are doing off-session work, meaning they have to take time from their paid job, if they have a paid job and are not retired or independently wealthy, to be able to do the work of being a legislature. If you've ever gotten a phone call on a Saturday or had to attend a 6:30 a.m. legislative breakfast and then drive over to another event and then talk to constituents and then do research for a bill. Most of us are doing that for at least 8 hours a week out of session. So we have a compensation amount of $242 a week. $242 a day, but it's 1 day per week, which is 1/5 of session compensation when we're in session. We had originally included compensation that would be for prep time for meetings. If you're like me and you take some time before the meeting to read the information you need to know, you then can't work your other job. So we posited a $30.25 hour amount for time spent in preparation for special or joint committee work. That was taken out by the Appropriations Committee. So that's really the compensation and benefits side. On the reimbursement side, almost all of these were removed by appropriations, but I'll still mention them because I think they're really relevant to some members on this side. The first is the child care and elder care benefit. Many members who have children or have to take care of a dependent are finding that the cost of that is actually not enough, or it's greater than their income that they're getting from this work. And it's also a burden on them to have to pay for work done for their children. So we have that members of the body and legislative staff, because oddly enough, they're not included in this as state employees now, they would be all eligible for up to $1,600 annually for the care expenses necessary to facilitate their job happening. So you can't just get your child care covered in the
Senate government operations version, you'd have to show that it's facilitating your work either as a legislature or legislative staff. And that would be only for households that are $75,000 or less in income. And that's tied directly to the state employees. So that's kind of two concepts here is average Vermont wage and then also tying it to state employees and what they're getting. And that's what we did with health insurance and the child care and dependent benefit.
All right, quick clarifying question from Representative Rowe.
When you're done, I have a question.
Okay, cool. So then we also had parking. We heard from members of the body who have a physical limitation that they were needing to move their cars. And the free parking here that those of us utilize and then walk to our accommodations then was still needing to be paid by those folks that we wouldn't pay as able-bodied people. Those folks were having to pay for parking at, let's say, I don't know, the Capitol Plaza, for example, because they had to move their car rather than walk back to the plaza. So we heard that from those with physical mobility challenges to be able to access parking reimbursement. That was taken out by appropriations. We also had professional development monies where members could receive a per diem payment so that when they're taking time off from their job, they're also getting compensated when they're doing things like the National Conference of State Legislators or learning something specific about the work that you do in your committee through a conference or other educational events. We also have the new member stipend, which we heard from many new members that the legislative orientation week was a hard thing for them to do because they had to take, for most of them, unpaid time off from their jobs because they weren't elected yet. Or they were elected, but they were not in office yet. So we did keep that in the as passed by the Senate bill to have that $240 per day amount be available for that legislative orientation. And then the additional things that I would note about this bill would be that we have a study. So we asked a lot of big questions in this bill about how we envision properly compensating our elected officials. And one of the big questions was diversity and inclusion. How do we get the next generation of working class Vermonters to be able to serve? What does that look like? And we didn't feel that we had fully addressed all of those questions in the bill. So we created a study committee that would look at a lot of different questions, including length of the session, which we know that Governor Phil Scott noted he would like us to go down to 13 weeks. That would be, I assume, something that they would facilitate in a discussion in that study. It also looks at the structure of the legislature. There's a couple of other points. If you have specific things, I can call them out. But the study is really to look at this question in an even greater sense than what we could do in the bill itself.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I know you've done a lot of work on this. I've already heard some people complaining that we shouldn't be doing this. Is there anything in this that forces people to take these raises, or can they opt out if they feel like they shouldn't get it?
That's a great question. So we actually asked Mike Ferrant, our Director of Legislative Operations is his title. And I asked him, hey, has someone got the ability to donate their salary or not accept their salary? Is that a possibility? And he said that, it really hasn't happened that frequently. And I would recommend him coming in and telling you this word for word, but doesn't seem to happen often. He may have facilitated it in the past, but someone could if they wanted. You're not obligated to take your salary. So if you're a wealthy Vermonter doing this job, you could certainly choose not to accept the salary. It might be a little wonky at the end because of taxes. So that would be the kind of, it sounded like the operational issue.
It has been done. We have a senator in Windham County, I believe.
Yeah, so Representative Rowe, I think we're going to have an opportunity, if the committee chooses to do some more work on this bill, to explore some of these questions. I think I want to be mindful that we probably have Senator White not for very long, since you all are headed back for a vote.
I don't see any green blinking lights, so.
So I just wanted to ask you high level before we lose you. Why is this important? Why are we being asked to do this? Why did the Senate pass this bill?
Yeah. think because our democracy demands having a diverse population be a part of the decision-making process. And unfortunately, the way that we're compensated and the benefits have been exclusionary to people who are working class, as well as people who have families. And we saw a mass exodus to that effect this last session, where over a third of both chambers did not run for reelection. And one of the key reasons that we heard cited over and over again was it was unaffordable to continue to be a state representative or a state senator, both from the lack of income when you leave a job, meaning you're literally taking a pay cut from your other position, or the lack of benefits because you now don't qualify for the benefits that you were qualifying for at a previous with your employer because of the time that you're taking off. So I would say that's why the bill is so important, is because we need to have a diverse and inclusive legislature. And the number one reason that we kept hearing from people on why they couldn't serve was because of the financial barrier to service. The last thing I'll say is I think this is stewardship of the General Assembly. And I say that because while certainly we as legislators might value our time and want to be compensated fairly now, the bill actually doesn't affect our salaries. The only folks who would be impacted by this compensation increase would be those who are reelected next session and then the session after that. So it's not an increase for us in that regard. Yeah, I would say those are the reasons why it's so important. But I will note the healthcare does start and the benefits do start prior to that.
Hear about some of those details when we do the walkthrough.
Can I recommend 2 reports to read?
Sure.
The Snelling report, very, very good. It calls out all of these points. And then we also had Representative Tiff Bloomley and Representative Gabrielle Stebbins had interns, I think in association with the Women's Caucus, do work on why folks of diverse backgrounds are less able to serve and what the barrier is to participation. And they did some really good survey work that got some quotes that were very compelling to why this is such a barrier for the average Vermonter.
Representative?
I'll add a little bit to the weight of that. I was surprised that last year, one of the people that quit for a better word, and I said, why? And it was circumstances of my life have changed. I've been in the legislature for a lot of years, but now my kids are going to college and I can't afford to be here. Life circumstances change. So it's not only people coming in the door. Sometimes it's the seasoned veterans who need some help too.
And it had surprised me actually to learn that and we had the National Conference of State Legislators come and give us how do we compare to other legislators. And it was sad actually to see that we now rank so low for compensation and benefits, even in like our bracket of part-time legislators. And even with the increases here, we would still be below average.
Thank you very much, Senator White. So, committee, are we comfortable? Jen, go ahead and give us a walkthrough now. We're going to be on the floor at 2:30, and I figure we can break a little bit early so that folks have a few minutes rather than break and then have to reconvene if that. All right, great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to me on this Friday afternoon. You were also attentive.
We're just so happy to not be talking about the previous bill that we spent a couple hours on, I think. At least this carries. Thank you very much, Senator White.
So let's go back.
I gotta tell you, I really hope that by next week we can figure out how to fix the latch of our door. It's been quite a problem today.
I mean, like, we're getting by, right? It's a little makeshift, but
You got some skill.
You know, we have a really fancy room. It's just
16
the
years in a
door.
restaurant.
You know, it's the door.
bubble gum.
Well, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. We, as usual, are a little punchy in the afternoon. And also,
Happy Friday.
a lot of distractions on Friday afternoon, so thank you for taking us through S39.
Sure. Thank you for having me. Jen Carby, Legislative Counsel. Do you like to put language up or do you just like to talk through it?
Yeah, we'll do it on our devices. I would say, given the time, I wasn't expecting a line by line, but if you could kind of walk us through this section by section of kind of what are the high points and
Sure.
what we're looking at as we think about taking this up potentially before the end of the session here.
Sure. All right, so this is S39. And so starting with the first section, this is the section on health benefits. And so this would amend the state employees' health benefit plan language to specify that members of the General Assembly are to be considered employees for purposes of eligibility for the state employees' health benefit plan. So that is on page 2. It looks like there's a lot more changing there than it is because some of it is just updating some language. So it also, so we have members of the General Assembly being counted as employees for not only the regular major medical health insurance, but also for the employee assistance program that is offered to state employees and to for the flexible spending account program for healthcare or dependent care expenses or both. So those are all things that state employees have that would be extended to the General Assembly. And on page 3, you can see that members of the General Assembly would pay the same kind of premium split, is what we often call it, as members of the employees of the executive branch, which is currently 80-20, what legislative employees pay as well. So the state would pay 80%, employee would pay 20%. Section 2 is that kind of beginning of that staggered legislator compensation. So section 2 deals with the 25-26 session. And it starts out first with non-leadership members, so not the speaker pro tem, but everybody else. For 2025, there will be a weekly salary of $1,000 a week plus an adjustment consistent with the compensation increase provided to other constitutional officers for fiscal year 2025. That's a very long way of saying it's a COLA plus average step increase that exempt state employees and constitutional officers get. So that's the indexing mechanism that is currently in your compensation statute as of 2021. For a long time before that, it was just the COLA piece. And so it had you lagging further and further behind. So this would, when I say you, the legislature, it doesn't necessarily mean you individually. This will be 25, 26. So that's the index, and I'll just refer to it as the index going forward. So for 2025, it'd be a weekly salary of $1,000 plus the FY25 index, because we don't know yet what that is. That'll be in next year's Pay Act. For 2026, it would go up to $1,100 a week, plus the index for fiscal years 25 and 26. And then we'll get to, in the next section, to what happens in FY27. So that's for non-speaker pro tem. For the speaker and pro tem, they would have a weekly salary amount of, in 2025, $1,230 a week plus the FY25 index. And for 2026, a weekly salary of $1,530 plus the 2 years worth of indexing. And I can give you some of the current numbers if it's helpful for context. If you go forward with this, you should definitely hear from Dan Dickerson in JFO, because he was my fiscal partner on this. And then also for the speaker and pro tem, as Senator White said, they do receive an annual salary in addition to the weekly in-session compensation. So that would go to $19,000 in 2025 plus the FY25 index, and for 2026, it would be $23,500 plus an index for fiscal years 25 and 26. And then subsection D is just saying that those are kind of the numbers that we use for all things on which legislator compensation is used for calculating per diems and things like that for those 2 years. Then in section 3, we go to the speaker and pro tem statute because it comes numerically first. And so their compensation would go to $28,300 for their annual salary. So kind of marched up a bit incrementally over time to $28,300 plus an adjustment consistent with the compensation increases, so the index for fiscal years 25, 26, and 27. So this is recognizing that here we are in 2023, trying to project what the indexing will be for those out years, and we don't know what those numbers are. So that's why they would have to be added in at the time. Beginning on January 1st, 2028, and then we just set this in motion going forward, and annually thereafter on January 1st, the annual compensation is indexed. So we're kind of resetting over the course of 3 years and then indexing annually going forward, but not doing a jump the way it would be in the 25, 26, 27. Does that make sense? Ish. Right. They will continue to be paid in biweekly installments. In addition, on page 6, the weekly compensation during the session would go to, for the speaker and pro tem, would be $1,830 a week, plus the indexing from fiscal years 25 through 27, and then beginning in 2028 and annually thereafter, we would have that just regular indexing. Just a conforming language change. Section 4, we get to the rest of the members of the legislature other than the speaker and pro tem. So this would be starting in 2027 would have the weekly salary be $1,210 plus the 3 years worth of indexing. And then in 2028, it would index annually, just 1 year's worth. Special session compensation is just kind of conforming change language in here, so it would still be 1/5 of the weekly amount per day of special session. That's what happens now as well. Then there's this idea on page 8 of adjournment compensation. So this would be new. This would be, as Senator White was saying, 1/5 of the weekly amount, so effectively 1 day's worth of compensation per week during the legislative adjournment. And then in subsection B, expenses gets, and we can go into the details, and there may be a piece, if you do go into this, to look at to make sure we're not creating something inadvertently greater than was intended. But in general, this is looking at creating the option for the legislator, each one of you, or those in your seats, of whether to receive reimbursement for meals and lodging the way it's done now, where you are entitled to a certain amount and that amount is taxable because you get it regardless of what your actual expenses are, or whether you would choose a reimbursement model where you'd be reimbursed for actual expenses, and that allows it to be non-taxable for both federal and state income tax purposes. So this would create effectively an optional accountable plan for legislators. So last year that happened with mileage, where it's now substantiated, get paid actual amounts traveled, and so you're able to, that's able to be non-taxable. This would, again, give the option to each member of whether to do these meals and lodging as reimbursement or as the allowance where you just get the amount regardless. Some additional detail for that.
Sounds very similar to a bill that Representative Harrison.
It is exactly like.
If I'm remembering correctly.
Yep. Yes, in fact, that's why the language is already drafted. Sorry, just pop it in.
Would you have a clarifying question?
Yeah, with the reimbursement method, would those records be subject to public?
That is a great question.
Yeah, because somebody would be like, oh.
Sorry?
Yeah, let's.
Sorry, you say help me or not?
Yeah, so we should definitely.
That's a great question that did not come up. I think there, at a minimum, there'd be the ability to redact. But I would want to check with Tucker on that.
Yeah, like could somebody just pull all of my meal expenses and be like, oh, she went and spent this much.
Might be, I think Tucker Anderson is probably the best person on the public records exemptions.
Oh, yeah.
So
Yes.
great question. So
It is a great question. I'm writing it down and I will check with Tucker. I think
we should look at that. My sense, looking back a couple of years since I looked at those things, is that it falls under one of those payroll or personnel exemptions. It's a level of detail that the public would be entitled to, I think, but we should get Tucker.
I think there could be a good argument for for that. But I'd want to check with our expert. Okay, and then on page 11, as Senator White said, the bill would create a stipend in that same daily amount, the 1/5 of the weekly compensation for each day that a member-elect of the General Assembly who is not an incumbent, because if you're an incumbent, you'd already be getting the adjournment pay, for each day of attendance at an orientation program for new legislators, and also existing members are not typically invited to participate. All right, and then we get to section 5, which is, I don't believe Senator White mentioned, this is a couple of changes to the legislative leave statute. Under existing law, as some of you may know, if you need to leave your job in order to serve in the legislature, you are entitled to a temporary or partial leave of absence, but certain conditions have to be met. One of them is that it's under current law only a full-time position, so this would get rid of that full-time modifier and have it just to be if you leave any position. The other is that under the existing law, you have to notify your employer of your intention to take the leave of absence within 10 days after filing the primary election nominating petition or taking any other action to put your name on the primary or general election ballot. And I think for a lot of people, especially first termers, they don't know that this legislative leave option even exists until well after that date has passed. So under the bill, the timing would change so that you would need, or a member would need to notify their employer of their intent to invoke the right to a leave of absence within 14 days. So 14 days instead of 10 days. But here's the important part, after being elected. So not after filing a primary nominating petition, but after the election. So it would extend the amount of time you have to, or a member would have to receive a leave of absence and from any type of job, not just a full-time job. Section 6 is the Legislative Service Working Group that Senator White was describing. It would be 3 members of the House and 3 members of the Senate. It would look into issues and make recommendations around legislative compensation and benefits, staffing, administrative support, and the length of the legislative session. And it goes into some detail on those about whether the amounts, even as adjusted in the bill, are appropriate, sufficient, whether there should be additional benefits offered, whether members should be able to choose to receive a prorated salary throughout the year, sort of like teachers do, rather than just during this session with the lesser amount for the adjournment. Whether there should be supplemental compensation to members in leadership positions other than just the speaker and pro tem, such as caucus leaders and committee chairs, how Vermont's benefits compare to those of other state legislatures, whether changes are necessary to staffing, like increasing the number of staff in existing offices or expanding the types of staff services available, adding caucus staff, adding personal staff, something like that. How to increase administrative support to members, whether changes should be made to the length or structure of the session, things like that. And you would be staffed by your legislative staff, this working group, and with a report due by January 15th to this committee, among others. And finally, there's an appropriation. $853,000 is appropriated for FY24, and that's for half a year's worth of health benefits. There are additional expenses in the out years that JFO can talk to you about. And then we have the effective dates, which typically aren't that important, but in this case are sort of relevant. So I will go through some of them. The ones around the legislative leave from employment and the working group would take effect on passage. The appropriation would begin at the beginning of the fiscal year on July 1st. The health benefits and then the optional reimbursement versus allowance of expenses would take effect in January of 24. So health insurance would start in next January, and then the legislator compensation for the 25-26 session would start at the beginning of the next fiscal year when we start FY25, and then everything else is January 1st, 2025.
So committee, before we break, any questions for Jen?
Let's move it.
High level, you ready? You ready? So,
Make the motion.
I have had an enormous amount of interest in this bill. So when I saw that it seemed like we would have some time before our second floor session, although our S9 conversation went a little longer than I planned. So it's one of the hardest things about this job is trying to figure out how long testimony is really going to take. I thought I'd at least give us a first look at the bill and appreciate Senator White and Jen helping us get a little preview of what's in there briefly. But would be interested in knowing the committee's thoughts. I would say that we have access to an awesome presentation that the Rules Committee saw about relative compensation for legislators that might be worthwhile for the committee to see next week. And that there are some other ideas that could strengthen this proposal. And I think when we start talking about our own compensation, it gets people pretty excited, both with fear and with the sense that maybe it could be a little easier for folks who have trouble affording to do this service to do it. So how are folks feeling about taking some further testimony on this next week when we get back? Representative Hendo.
Thank you. I would like to see that video for sure, comparing to see if we're really comparing apples to apples. So that would be helpful.
I think we may be able to get the NCSL experts on that to actually do the presentation.
That would be great.
for us.
Yes, they did Senate GovOps.
I will reserve any other comments until that point. Thank you.
Representative Byron.
As long as I've been hovering around in a member of this General Assembly, this has been a conversation and a stress point for serving members and outgoing members, many of whom have asked to have this conversation more seriously addressed as they run after COVID. So I wholeheartedly endorse continuing to discuss this.
Representative Cooper.
I think if we've established that there's a need and it's a pressing need, putting it off for 4 years is dereliction of duty to some degree.
Say again, I'm sorry.
Putting it off for 4 years is dereliction of duty. If we have a problem, we should move to solve it, and the appearances be damned.
At the risk of now starting our debate, I was hoping that we would have next week. We got 2 minutes here.
Just quickly, this has been an ongoing subject for many years, and I certainly have heard from my constituents already and have had or heard over the years that they believe for the work that we do down here, we're being compensated.
That's one of my notes I have.
And they know how much we get compensated? Because everybody, a lot of people that I speak to who are like, oh, you're talking about this, they think we're like full-time, like 70 Gs, Cadillac benefits.
So that's another concern.
So there's my experience is they have a broad misunderstanding as to what compensation looks like for this role.
So I'll call on people who promise. Representative Boyd.
I just want to make note that I've heard the exact opposite from my constituents, and that, for the amount of time that we need to take off of work and then the amount of work that we put into this role, that our compensation does need to be looked at and considered. Just wanted to make that note.
Yeah, well,
Representative Boyd.
I'll continue that. I maybe it's who's talking to who, but I get the opposite, the optics on it stink, and that how dare you, I've gotten emails that basically is like, how dare you guys continue to even think about putting more in your pockets? And I'm like, start the conversation, but I'm just saying, it's there. And yeah, I've yet to have one person say, please do that. And in fact, one went on to say, didn't y'all a couple sessions ago tie yourselves to the state COLA increases? Yes, which is true. I said, yes, that was done. They said, and their opinion was that was sufficient. But again, that's a constituent's interest.
Representative.
I can understand how, I can see legitimately a lot of sides to this. I know when I found out what it was, I was like, I don't know if I can do this. And I also, like people are always struggling, so it feels bad to take more, from the state funds. But I think like on the balance, it would, I don't know, I'm looking forward to seeing the NCSL presentation also. And I think it's definitely important to talk about in the whole spectrum of what would be considered in the study also. I'm looking forward to that, so.
Representative Lewicki.
I'd like to keep looking at this, and I think if we do take up the bill, I'd like to make sure we put an opt-out clause in there, both for the salary and the health benefits. Some people don't need the health benefits, and some people.
That would be
whatever, yeah, they would, whether it's politically or financially, think it's not a good decision, let them opt out.
Yeah, I think we'll, what we really should do in the context of this is put the ideas on the table and talk about them. I want to make sure that we, at this point, sounds like there's interest in hearing a little bit more, which we will do. And then I just want to caution everyone about before we hear testimony saying this is what we should do. So right now we have a suggestion that seems like it's got some strong opinions already from the Senate. And so let's figure out what's in there and then we'll work on that. Anybody can always donate any money that they receive as income, which is one way of opting out. Representative Chase, did you have your hand up before I go to Representative? Okay, Representative Hoover, go ahead.
2 points. I think probably we'll find that the people whose constituents negative opinion is probably because of these big pickup trucks that they drive.
I'll caution the member about any stereotyping around types of vehicles or.
As applied or perceived to parkability.
Does the healthcare benefit, is it a component of the plan or is it a component of statute that when you reach a certain age, you have to shift over to Medicare?
You do not have to shift over to Medicare. So we looked a lot into health benefits, state health benefits for people who become Medicare eligible while in state service, and you can defer your Part B enrollment and continue to take the state employees plan. Or you can go on to, typically it would be whatever was most financially advantageous to the individual member, whether the member did Medicare and paid for their own supplemental, or whether it was more cost effective for them to do the 20% employee share on the state employee plan. But there is not a requirement that you go off as an effectively active state employee, that you go off the state employee plan to pick up Medicare.
Yeah, these are definitely the reason I wanted to do a little bit of preliminary today was that if we are going to take more testimony, I wanted folks to be able to get a sense of what questions they want to ask for next meeting. So again, thank you so much. We are being called up to the floor, so we'll adjourn and go off live.